This short story is self-published by J.T. Dusky, and the name is Lassiter, The Start of Celerity. Thomas Lassiter tied his tie while standing in front of a full-length mirror that hung on the rear side of his office door. His blue tie matched his gray suit coat, blending in well with his graying hair and 2-day stubble. Lassiter was fortunate to have good looks, and women were naturally attracted to him. He tried marriage in the past, but it didn't work out. The woman he married got tired of waiting for him to come home late each night and began having an affair with the next-door neighbor. As a top-secret agent for the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, ASIS, he was directly responsible for several operations around the world. He managed 18 field agents that were located mainly in China and Hong Kong, but now he was also carrying out secret operations in the United States and Germany. Lassiter was a trained killer, but his high degree of intelligence always kicked in before the urge to kill. He weighed his options carefully and never chose killing as the first option. This trait moved him up quickly within the intelligence ranks of ASIS, and he was well respected by the other agents that worked with or knew of him. He graduated with first-class honors from the University of Melbourne, having majored in politics and international studies. He was going to go into law school, but was approached by an officer in ASIS and quickly decided he would take that career path. Now, he was pleased that he did, as he found his job to be very rewarding. As he was standing in front of the mirror combing his salt and pepper short hair, the telephone on his office desk started ringing. He quickly shoved his black comb in his pocket and walked over to his desk. "Lassiter," he answered in his crisp, clear voice. Lassiter had an excellent speaking voice, and due to this ability, he was often chosen as the orator for engagements like the one he was soon going to. "The SVR agents are here to talk to you," the woman on the other line responded. "I have shown them into the meeting room." "Very well," Lassiter answered back and hung up the phone. He briefly stopped to take one last look in the mirror as he was walking towards the door. "Morning, Mr. Lassiter," a young secretary said to him as he was walking down the hall. She had a secret crush on him and would often flirt with him, but he wasn't interested. Lassiter liked women that were close to his age of 53, not girls that were less than half his age. But he always responded nicely. "Good morning, Sandy," he said as he opened the door to the meeting room. The meeting room was periodically checked for bugs, and was built in such a way that nobody on the outside could hear the conversation that was going on inside. Today, that was especially important because the meeting was no doubt going to contain top-secret classified information. The two Russian intelligence officers stood up as Lassiter entered the room. "Please take a seat." Lassiter sat down across the table from them. "Today I wanted to tell you about an American program that you are most likely unaware of. I believe it is important that we establish a network of agents in different countries to gather new intelligence about this program so that we can help prevent an improper balance in power and prevent World War III from occurring. The threat I am going to be discussing is a new one. Not ever before has a country had this type of technology that will enable them to crush the other intelligence agencies if we do not do anything about it. Our lives are at stake." The two SVR agents didn't say a word and sat motionless, like marble statues sitting outside in front of distinguished buildings. They both had their hands resting on the table with their fingers on both hands interlaced. They were older than Lassiter, and most likely were old KGB agents. The SVR formed after the fall of the Soviet Union and replaced the old KGB. These men most likely lost their old positions and obtained new ones within the new spy agency. The United States is working on developing psychic spies that can read each other's minds, but this isn't the half of it. They believe that these spies will be able to bend normal people's thoughts in such a way that they can tell them what and when to do things. Could you possibly imagine the impact this will have on Russia if they could use spies to coerce normal Russian people in overthrowing Yeltsin? Where will it stop? If they succeed, they will be able to manipulate your soldiers in charge of nuclear weapons to launch them when they want to. Do you see the gravity of this situation? How do we know that we can trust you? One of the SVR agents responded. We have no knowledge of this program, and I think we would have heard about it by now. The man spoke English very well, but his Russian accent would give him away to anyone living in the United States. He then turned to the other agent and translated Lassiter's speech to him. When he was finished, they both returned to their former motionless positions. Think of the ramifications if you do not trust me. Lassiter appeared to be sincere, and then reached over to his left and grabbed a pitcher that was full of ice water. He snatched one of 4 glasses that was on the table beside the pitcher and poured himself a glass. As he poured the water, a large chunk of ice slipped over the lip and splashed into his glass, leaving a small puddle of water on the desk. He didn't worry about it. He just looked at the SVR agents and asked politely if they wanted a glass. The agent that did the talking nodded his head in affirmation. The other agent spoke in Russian to the other one. Lassiter filled 2 glasses and handed to them, now knowing that only one of the agents spoke English. Lassiter sat quiet as the 2 agents discussed whether or not they could trust him. Then after a minute, the one who did all the talking looked back at him. Okay, what do you want us to do to help? I would like you to send at least 1 agent to Erie, Pennsylvania to monitor and keep tabs on a man that we have codenamed 66, aka Apollo. The Russian took a big gulp of his water and set the glass back down on the table. Is he one of these telepathic soldiers? He asked as Lassiter walked over to a bright silver filing cabinet and leafed through the many files contained in it. After a few seconds of searching, he pulled out a thick 2-inch folder and handed it to the man. Everything you need to know about him is in here. Basically, we do think Apollo has telepathic abilities, but is not using them for some reason or another. It's like he is a sleeper agent waiting to be activated. The Russian agent immediately started flipping through the pages in the folder. After a minute, he closed it and shoved it back across the table at Lassiter. You want me to believe that this started when an extraterrestrial spaceship crashed and the United States government located dead aliens? I know it's hard to believe, but we have a mole at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and this shit is real. Take the time to read through the file and you'll most likely believe. Lassiter stood up and walked over to a desk that had a couple cardboard boxes on it. They appeared to be made just for files. He then asked for the file back and placed it in the box. Then he taped the box shut and ran another piece of tape perpendicular to the flaps to ensure that the box would not open. He carried it back to the Russian agents and placed it in front of them. That's all I have for today. If you have any questions after reading through the file, please don't hesitate to contact me. The Russian agents left the room and Lassiter got on the phone. Julia, I need you to drop what you're doing and come into the meeting room for a few minutes. Julia was a senior field agent for ASUS. Currently, she was working on secret operations in China, trying to gather intelligence on a new technology that they were working on. Supposedly, they were developing a device that could transport messages from one location up to 1,000 miles away. So far, ASUS was coming up short, and the Chinese counterintelligence was doing a good job at securing their secrets. Julia knocked on the meeting room door, and Lassiter let her in. The meeting room door would automatically lock in order to prevent agents from forgetting to lock it when they were having meetings. Have a seat, Julia. We need to talk about your future here." As Julia walked by to take a seat, Lassiter could smell the heavy scent of tobacco smoke on her clothing. It was obvious that she just got back from a smoke break. "We need you in the field, but the operation that you will be heading is in America. We're taking you off of Chinese operations." Julia looked surprised and responded defensively. "I'm doing everything I am supposed to be doing in China. It will take some time to see results. We can't abandon operations there now." "Yes, we can, and yes, we are," Lassiter replied sternly. "We have something even more important for you." Julia fidgeted in her seat and couldn't help but bounce her right leg up and down on the ball of her foot. Before Lassiter could speak again, she began. "Where am I going? Washington, D.C.? New York City?" "No, you're going to a much smaller town. It's called Erie, Pennsylvania. It's a Lake Erie port city located between Buffalo, New York and Cleveland, Ohio. Pittsburgh is only a couple hours to the south." Lassiter already pulled it up on satellite imagery and zoomed in so Julia could watch the downtown for a few minutes. The downtown was not very big, and there weren't any real tall skyscrapers. There were a couple buildings that were fairly tall, but nothing like in larger cities. Most of the buildings looked at least a couple decades old, and people were walking in and out of them, indicating that most of them were being used. "Do I have to go?" Julia asked as she slid Lassiter's laptop back around and pushed it to him. "I am pretty happy here." Lassiter closed his laptop and smiled at Julia. When he smiled at her, it was always hard for her to say no, as she always wanted to date him. Like most women, she thought Lassiter was quite a catch. He received a high salary from ASUS, and he was an excellent investor. He was a millionaire, and although his net worth was well over $50 million, most people could not tell. Most of his wealth was tied up in real estate. "Yes, you have to go, and I'm going to be sending a cryptologist to Erie also, so you guys can pal around. Australian intelligence has some very good cryptologists trained to decipher and decode intercepted messages. They needed to send one to Erie because the man that was to be part of their surveillance program was writing coded messages to groups on the internet. Lassiter wanted to know the code so that he could be the one of the first people to know what each message meant. Good. It will be nice to know somebody else from Australia. We can talk about kangaroos and platypus in our spare time." Lassiter chuckled and was pleased with her levity. Now he could work on buying her a house and making the arrangements to get her into the United States. After he met with Julia, he went back to his office to read through a couple agents' files in order to determine if they were suitable for the cryptologist job. He spent a couple hours sifting through each of the files, trying to discern which person would be the best choice for the operation. He decided to call them both in for interviews, but he would wait until Julia was not in the building to do so. He didn't want Julia to see the men before he had made his choice, so she could not bug him and influence his decision in any way. The following Friday, Julia was going to be out of the office. Lassiter decided that it would be an excellent day to arrange the interviews. He called each agent at their homes and asked if they would be interested in interviewing for a field agent job. Both of the prospective field agents answered in the affirmative. On Friday, Lassiter had business to take care of with his financial advisor and then showed up to work during lunch hour. He had scheduled the interviews for 1 and 3:30 p.m. respectively, so once again he had to go through each file and become familiar with each potential field agent. Each one of them seemed like they would be a good fit for the operation, and Lassiter really did not have a preference. Usually before interviews he had a favorite, one that stood out above the rest. However, this time he needed to talk to them. They both worked in a different office, and he had no idea who they were, except on paper. The first interviewee was Sandra Johnson, originally from Brisbane. Sandra was in her late 30s and was single. In fact, she was never married and didn't have any children. She was in good shape, and Lassiter knew immediately that she would have no problem doing the job physically. She came highly recommended from her superiors, and in the last 10 years only missed 2 days of work. She was somewhat attractive, and the facial feature that stood out on her was her big, dark, glowing brown eyes. As she walked into the meeting room, Lassiter met her at the door and extended his right arm out for a handshake. He was surprised when she gripped his hand like a soldier and was not expecting it. He liked when people would firmly shake his hand and instantly thought more of her. Many men had shaken Lassiter's hand, and many had a much weaker grip than she just exhibited. "Mr. Lassiter, I'm Sandy Johnson. It's a great pleasure to finally meet you." "The pleasure is mine," he responded with a welcoming smile. "Please take a seat." Sandy sat down on the other side of the table and was rather calm for such an important interview. She was one of the top cryptologists in ASIS, and if she was chosen for the assignment in the United States, there were other capable cryptologists that could fill her position. "Today's interview is going to be really short," Lassiter said as he handed Sandy a piece of paper. On the paper was a message that was encoded. "I want you to work on this code right now, and I'll be back in 2 hours to see how you're doing. This is the type of code that we are intercepting." Sandy glanced down at the code and grabbed a pencil from a container that was sitting on the table. Lassiter stood up and said good luck as he walked out of the door. Sandy studied the code for several minutes and noticed it contained letters, symbols, and numbers. She had never quite seen one before, but it looked like it could be solved through a series of trial and error. The first thing she had to figure out was the language that the code was written in. She immediately thought it was an ancient Egyptian because some of the symbols were in hieroglyphics, but the letters were all in English. She had studied hieroglyphics in college, but up to this point had never the need to use them in any way. She recognized that what she was looking at was the Eye of Horus, also known as the Wedget. An hour went by fast, and Sandy had not figured out any of the code yet. She was frustrated and leaned forward in her chair, resting her head on her hands that were supported by her elbows. After a couple minutes, she decided to give the code another attempt. Lassiter promptly returned after the 2 hours had expired. "Well, how did you do?" he asked as he leaned back against the wall and folded his arms in front of him. Sandy looked discouraged but gave a positive answer. "Not very well. However, if I had more time, I believe that I would figure this out. 2 hours just wasn't enough time." "How much time do you think you would need?" Lassiter genuinely wanted to know the answer because he believed that it would take a good cryptologist a week or two to decipher the code. "I think I could have decoded this in a week. Can I take it with me and give it a shot?" "I was hoping you would ask that question," Lassiter replied. "I read through your files and I'm pretty confident you could do it in a week also. Go ahead and take it with you and call me at this number when you are finished with it." He handed Sandra a business card that had both his work and private cell phone number on it. Then he wrapped up the meeting and escorted her to the building's elevator. 15 minutes later, his next interviewee arrived. He came highly recommended from an old colleague of Lassiter's and was highly respected throughout ASIS as one of the best cryptologists. Once in the meeting room, Lassiter gave him the same exact code as Sandra. He also allowed him 2 hours to try to decipher the code. After 2 hours, Lassiter returned and sat down across from the interviewee. "So, Mr. Johansson, were you able to decode any of the message?" James Johansson dropped his pencil on the table and slid a couple sheets of paper across to Lassiter. One of the sheets contained the code. The other sheet was Johansson's scratch sheet, where he wrote down substitution letters of the alphabet and numbers in an attempt to crack it. The code is using numbers for vowel letters, and based on those numbers, one can determine what the other letters really are. Lassiter genuinely smiled. "Tell me more." He already knew exactly what the deciphered code read. He had it deciphered by one of his counterintelligence specialists. He knew Johansson was on the right track. "Well, the letter A has been assigned the number 25. E has been assigned the number 20. I represents 15. O has been switched with U and has been assigned the number 5. And U has been given the number 10. "Very good," Lassiter responded. "You're exactly right, and you're exactly right for the job. You sure you want to leave Australia and become a field agent?" "Yes, sir." "All right then. We're going to get everything set up as soon as possible, and you'll be hearing from me. Have you ever been to the United States before?" "No, sir. I have only been to countries in Europe." "Well, I think you might like it, and you'll have no problem getting accustomed." Lassiter then stood up and leaned across the table, reaching out to get a handshake from James. "I'll be in touch within 1 week." He then ended the meeting. The following Monday, Lassiter called Julia into the meeting room. He told her that he had chosen a cryptologist that would serve as a field agent in Boston, Massachusetts, and help her in any way possible. "I want you to be ready to go in 2 weeks. I don't know if I will be back in the office by then, so my secretary will handle all your arrangements. Here are your plane tickets." Julia snatched the plane tickets out of his hand. "Yes, sir. I'll do a splendid job for you in the States." She then placed the tickets inside of her purse, and when she pulled her hand out, a pack of cigarettes plopped onto the floor. She bent over quickly to retrieve them. "I should probably quit these things," she said, somewhat embarrassed. "I'm not the guy to tell you to do that." "I have my vices too," Lassiter replied. He wasn't just pacifying her. He loved to indulge in smoking high-priced Don Arturo cigars and doing shots on the rocks of expensive tequilas. Right after Julia left the building, Lassiter went to his office and grabbed a large black suitcase. He then got on the phone and called for a taxi to take him to the airport. His trip was to the United States to purchase houses for both Julia and James. Lassiter flew into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and rented a car. He documented in paperwork that he was having a meeting with the CIA agents, but instead he was in the United States for a totally different reason. He drove the 2.5 hours from Pittsburgh to Erie, and once there, he drove down Davison Avenue. He noticed that one house was for sale and stopped to find out more information on it. In a clear plastic brochure holder affixed to the realtor sign were flyers that contained information on the house. He grabbed one and then went back into his vehicle to read it. He was pleased to discover that the asking price on the house was only $82,500. He then drove the rest of the way down Davison, looking for another possible house. There weren't any other houses for sale, so at the bottom of the road he hung a right. He drove a couple minutes and then found another real estate sign. While he was driving down the road, he saw 2 other houses for sale. He stopped and took down the realtor numbers and decided that he would call them in the morning. He was tired from his flight, wanting to go to a hotel and relax. He drove back up to the highway where he saw a couple of hotels that didn't look too bad. He decided to stay at a Hilton, and while he was checking in, he politely asked the hotel clerk where the lounge was at. He wanted to wind down and have a couple drinks. "It's down that hall and through the glass door," the clerk responded, handing him a room key. Lassiter knocked on the counter twice, his knuckles making a rather loud thud. "Thank you," he replied as he headed towards the elevator. His room was nicer than expected, with brand new amenities. He changed into tan khakis and a Ralph Lauren green polo shirt that he often wore when he went golfing. He was kind of superstitious and tried to wear the shirt when he needed some good luck, having once hit a hole-in-one on a par 3 hole while he was golfing in Germany with a couple of German assets. Needless to say, the Germans were highly impressed with his golfing finesse. Lassiter basically had a Visa credit card with no limit. He paid it off each month and never carried a balance, so the bank just kept on raising his limit. He hardly ever carried more than $100 on him, and today was no different. He only had about $40 in his wallet, having stopped at Capital One Bank on his way to Erie. In order for him to carry on secret missions around the world, he was in possession of 7 different accounts in various countries. His American account by far had the most funds in it. It was worth several $1,000,000. It was a Saturday night and the lounge was busy. As Lassiter sat down at the bar, he could hear the singing of Happy Birthday in the back of the lounge. He couldn't help but watch as a pretty brunette blew out the candles on a birthday cake. There were only 2 candles on the cake, a number 2 followed by the number 1. Even though the drinking age in Australia is 18, he didn't think much of the number on the cake. He was too busy watching the bartender circle around the bar, filling everyone's glasses, but apparently ignoring him. Finally, the bartender stopped in front of him. "What can I get for you?" Lassiter could barely hear him above the loud music coming from a person attempting to sing karaoke. "Your finest tequila. I'll have a double on the rocks." The bartender nodded and walked over to the booze bottles. He grabbed an añejo tequila from the top shelf and then grabbed a pair of metal tongs. He plucked a couple ice cubes out of a round stainless steel bowl resting by the bottles. He then poured a couple shots into Rock's glass and then tipped the bottle up again, giving him a little bit extra. "That'll be $300. Driver's license and credit card, please, if you want to start a tab." Lassiter wasn't the least bit fazed by the price. He regularly did shots of tequila that cost as much as $200 a shot. It was worth it, as the lower-priced tequilas always gave him a hangover. He handed the bartender his driver's license as well as his credit card. After he drank the tequila, he decided that he had enough and that he would call it a night. "Please check me out," he said to the bartender when he wasn't busy serving the other patrons. The bartender swiped his card and brought him back a receipt to sign. Normally, Lassiter was a great tipper. However, he didn't feel the need to leave a 20% tip on just one drink served. $20 is large enough tip, he thought to himself as he scribbled the number down on his receipt. He then went up to his room and got on his laptop to find out more information on the houses that he drove by. All 3 houses that he was interested in were below $100,000. If he chose 2 of them, he could pay the full price and close on them quickly. As he searched the internet for additional houses, his eyes grew heavy, and then he dozed off. He woke up an hour later with his laptop still open and the lights in the room on. He decided it was time to call it a night. The following morning, he was up and ready for the day by 7:30 a.m. Lassiter usually only slept about 6 hours a night, even if he had a few drinks the night before. By 10 a.m., he was with the realtor looking at the house on Davison. The house was a ranch and was well maintained. It was built in the 60s, and Lassiter couldn't find any problems with it. The walls were all newly painted white, and the appliances included with it all were clean and in good working order. "I'll take it," he said after his first walkthrough. He didn't even haggle as he thought the price was fair. "How soon can my cousin move into it?" The realtor was thrilled that he decided to buy it. "Well, that depends on how fast we can close on it. How much are you putting down on it?" Lassiter reached into his back pocket and pulled out his expensive Italian genuine cowhide wallet. He then handed the realtor his Visa card. "I'm putting the whole thing down. Does that mean my cousin can move in?" The realtor looked at the name on the card because he had forgotten it. "Mr. Lassiter, are you sure you want this house?" I have several by the lake that are much nicer and may be more suitable to your liking. The houses by the lake are some of the more expensive in the Erie area. Many of them are upwards of $350,000, and the realtor was trying hard to increase her commission. This house is perfect for my cousin, but I'll tell you what, if you can show me another house today that is also under $100,000, and I can close on that one quickly, I'll toss you an extra $1,000 bonus. Deal, the realtor loudly responded. I can show you 3 houses within 2 miles of here. Follow me. Lassiter got into his rental car and took one last look at the house. It would be a good house for Julia, and he knew she would be fine with it. Now he had to find a house for Johansson. Although he was going to Boston first, within several years he would be assigned to Erie. The realtor pulled over in front of another ranch that was similar to the first one. After they walked through, Lassiter was pleased enough to tell the realtor that her job was done. He would take the house. He got both houses for under $200,000, and that was well below his budget. Before he left Erie, he decided to open up a couple bank accounts for Julia and James. He opened them up at separate banks and only placed $7,500 in each one so that the U.S. federal government wouldn't be involved. Anytime a deposit is made for more than $10,000, the bank is required to fill out a form and submit it to the government. Lassiter wanted to avoid this so that Julia and James would not be scrutinized. They would most likely already be looked at because of the home purchases. He had now paved the way for his agents to come to Erie, so he drove back to Pittsburgh and boarded an airplane back to Melbourne. Julia and James still had a few days to take care of business in Australia before they would leave for the United States. They were scheduled to fly out on separate days on different airlines. Julia was going to fly into Pittsburgh just like Lassiter did. James was flying into Boston, Massachusetts 2 days later. He was needed in Boston for right now, and soon would join Julia in Erie. Lassiter knew that the Russians were probably moving even faster than he was. They most likely already had agents in Erie that were being assigned to monitor Agent 66. He figured the more agents that knew about 66, the better. But he wanted to keep the Chinese intelligence agency, the Ministry of State Security, MSS, at bay. The situation would become too dangerous if they uncovered the information that he already knew. He wanted the Russians to get a whiff of the program, but he didn't want them to discover more than he already knew. He figured that because they were far behind, that they would not catch up. When Lassiter got back to Australia, he didn't go back to the ASIS office in Melbourne. Instead, he traveled to a top-secret laboratory in Adelaide. There were only 21 individuals that had sufficient clearances to be allowed into this laboratory, and he was one of them. As he drove up to the gate entrance to the laboratory grounds, an armed soldier approached his vehicle. In front of the gate was a German Leopard tank, which was protecting the compound. The tank moved forward to within 6 feet of the front of his vehicle. "Identification," the soldier shouted before Lassiter could even hit the button to lower his driver's side window. Lassiter had his identification badge ready and sitting on the passenger's seat. He had been here many times before and knew the routine to get in. They would check his identification, and while they were doing so, a picture was taken of his vehicle license plate. The plate was quickly verified, and then he would be allowed to enter. One of the guards that sometimes worked the gate knew Lassiter, and the entry process would go smoother and faster. However, this was a new guard, and he was taking his time making sure that Lassiter had the required clearances. "Have a pleasant visit," the soldier said after a couple minutes. He handed Lassiter his identification badge and then motioned to the tank driver. The tank then backed up out of the way, and the gate opened, allowing Lassiter to drive through. Once inside the compound, Lassiter knew exactly where to head. He headed towards a building on the right that was cube-like in structure and consisted of 3 stories. Once inside the building, he walked down a narrow hallway on the first floor and into a spacious room with a large television on the wall. In the middle of the room was an open-air area where individuals could go and smoke cigarettes or sit outside and look up at the night sky. If it was during the day, like right now, they could simply get some sunshine. Most of the people were watching the television, but several were in the outside area. He walked over and sat down by a group of 3 women whose stares were affixed on the television. "Well, I just got back from the United States where I purchased 2 houses for a couple agents. It's almost time." The women all turned their attention to Lassiter, and all smiled similarly. They nearly looked identical and had smooth, milky white skin that looked like it was never sunburned. Their dark brown chestnut hair was shiny, straight, and flowed down to the middle of their backs, cut perfectly with no frizzy ends. Each of them was wearing identical clothes, which consisted of a plain white t-shirt and greenish-blue long pants. All of them wore white shoes without laces. The movie on the television was obviously a love story. Lassiter was interrupting a love-making scene, and the women quickly turned their attention back to the movie. Lassiter always felt very comfortable around the women. He didn't need to have physical contact with them to feel this way. He was just happy to be near them every chance that he could get. He wasn't into chick flicks, but he had spent the last 9 hours in the car driving here and wasn't ready to get back in his vehicle and drive back to Melbourne. The women didn't mind at all that he had joined them, but they didn't say a word. They just sat there watching the movie intently. About 20 minutes later, the movie ended, and 3 nurses immediately came out of their station carrying blood pressure cuffs. Each nurse took the right arm of a woman and attached the cuff to their wrist. A few seconds later, they wrote down the readings on a clipboard. "How do you feel, sweetie?" a heavy-set female nurse said to one of the women. The woman looked directly at her and smiled, much in the same way as when she smiled at Lassiter. The nurse then took off her blood pressure cuff and scribbled some words down on the paper that was affixed to the clipboard. The other 2 nurses removed the cuffs off of the other 2 women, and then the nurses walked back to their station. The women then stood up and walked single file to a carpeted area in front of the television. They all sat down in a circle, crossing their legs and joining hands. Lassiter watched as they closed their eyes and sat motionless for over 15 minutes. Then they opened their eyes, broke the chain they created by joining their hands, and stood up. After this, one of them walked over to a 6-foot-tall white wooden cupboard. She opened up the cupboard and pulled out a board game. Then she walked back over to the table Lassiter was sitting at and sat down. The other 2 women closely followed her. The women appeared to be in their upper 20s and looked too old to be playing the game that she picked out. She chose Chutes and Ladders, a game designed for children, and all 3 women seemed interested in playing it. Lassiter sat and watched as they each took turns rolling the die and moving their piece around the board. None of the women showed any anger or hostility while playing the game and remained focused all the way until one of them won by landing on the last square. They just finished the game when a nurse came out of the station carrying a tray with small cartons of milk and baggies that had miniature cookies. The nurse gave each woman a milk in a baggie and then looked at Lassiter. "Would you like a small snack?" "No, thank you," Lassiter replied as the women were already tearing into their baggies. He laughed to himself as he watched all 3 women do the same exact thing. They carefully ripped the top of the baggie, and then instead of pouring the contents into their hands, they plucked out a tiny cookie one by one. After eating 3 cookies, they all opened their milks and drank at the same time. When the women finished their snacks, they all stood up and walked single file to a trash can that was sitting outside the nurse's station. Each of them tossed their empty baggie and milk carton into the can and then walked back and sat by Lassiter. Lassiter then stood up and walked up to the nurse's station. The heavy-set nurse met him at the window. "How can I help you?" "Could I please review their food sheet?" "Sure, let me make you a copy so you can take it with you." "That'll be fine," Lassiter responded as he watched the women while he waited. Now they were again sitting there, this time watching a cartoon that was playing on the television. A minute later, the nurse handed Lassiter a couple sheets of paper. "Thank you, have a nice night." Lassiter got what he came for and left the building. As Lassiter was driving back to Melbourne, he couldn't help but think about his father and his brother, who both served in the Royal Australian Navy. Both of them were now dead, and the only close relatives that Lassiter had now were the 3 women he just visited. He knew it was his responsibility to take care of his brother's daughters, and in the near future he would do his best to do that. But for right now, their place was in the compound. When Lassiter was just barely a teenager, his father told him a story that he promised he would keep secret. Before he and his brother were born, a spaceship landed in the bush, and the military captured 4 humanoid beings that weren't from this planet. He didn't know where the spaceship came from, nor did anyone in the military. The government decided it was in their best interest not to move the spaceship, but rather build a brand new facility around it. The government repeatedly tried to carry on conversations with the aliens to no avail. They could seemingly communicate with each other, but not with military personnel. Then Lassiter's father had a major breakthrough. He would show one of the aliens a picture of a planet in our galaxy, and a different alien in another room would draw a picture of it. Lassiter's father then knew that the aliens communicated with each other telepathically. He knew that if they could communicate telepathically, that they would be able to be taught using the same system. His goal was to teach the aliens the English language, and he began teaching them the animals in Australia. One by one, the aliens were shown slides of animals with the name of the animal below the image. The aliens were very fast learners, and by the end of the first week, they could recognize and write the names of 20 different animals common to the Australian bush. The following week, they moved on to plants. The first plant that Lassiter's father showed the aliens was the Australian blackthorn. He had taken actual samples from the bush and was allowing the aliens to hold and feel the plant. One of the aliens picked up the plant and then smashed it with his other hand. He then let out a squeal like a rabbit in pain. He immediately dropped the plant and was bleeding a dark green fluid. One of the other aliens quickly grabbed his hand with their hand, and within several seconds the bleeding had stopped. Lassiter's father later picked up the plant without thinking about it. When he did, one of the thorns pierced his left index finger, and some of the alien fluid that was on it entered his skin. Shortly after this incident, he started hearing voices in his head. Unbeknownst to him, he was developing telepathy. After a few months, Lassiter's father could communicate with the aliens. Because he passed all of the government health screenings, the government decided to test the alien fluids on other military personnel. Lassiter's father interviewed and chose several study participants. Then the unthinkable happened. Before they could test the fluid on other individuals, one night when Lassiter's father was away, the facility was blown to pieces. It was an inside job, but Lassiter's father could not find out who did it. The aliens and everything in the facility were lost, and the grounds were bulldozed and removed. He was one of the only people that knew that telepathy existed, but now he had nobody to help him enhance his skills. Then he received a tip from a German asset named Hans Dieter. Hans told him that he heard through the grapevine that the United States was working on a top-secret telepathy program. He didn't have much information to supply, but he said that extraterrestrials were found, and their brain tissue was being used to make animals telepathic. Lassiter's father concluded that the goal of the American program was to develop human telepaths just like he was trying to do in Australia. He then started his own organization and Celerity was born. Celerity's goal was to monitor and track all potential telepathic individuals and relocate them to Australia where they could live with one another without the interference of government exploitation. Shortly after forming Celerity, Lassiter's father died of a heart attack. Thomas Lassiter took over his father's organization. Currently, based on intercepted messages on the internet, he knew that Agent 66, aka Apollo, should be protected at all costs and relocated when the time was right. If he got into the wrong hands, it could be disastrous for the entire world. Thank you for listening to my story, Lassiter, the Start of Celerity. The full-length novel Celerity is now available on Amazon, and I also have another short story on Amazon. The name of it is The Return of Ra 2020. If you liked my short read, please tell others about it and follow me on Facebook. I really appreciate all of your support. Thanks again. Sincerely, JT Dusky.